Hello, my name is Spencer and I like to make tiny dorky projects to escape reality for a bit. This Anakin Skywalker from the tabletop board game Star Wars Legion is the most recent miniature I have painted, and I think he is deserving of his very own display diorama. For this display, I will use Anakin and some B1 battle droids. I painted these droids a while ago and at different times, so they all look slightly different and mismatched. This display will give me a wonderful opportunity to remake them into a single cohesive unit. For the base of this display, I used a pre-cut piece of wood I got from my local hobby store, and I made sure that I had enough space for each miniature. I plan on adding some lighting to this project later, so I needed to make some room beneath for a battery pack. To do this, I used a 1/2-inch balsa wood dowel to elevate the base up. I'm no professional woodworker, but I just took my careful time eyeballing the dimensions needed to make a sturdy base. Overall, I just marked it out, cut the wood, and sanded down the edges. Once I was all wooded out, I could clean up my working space a bit. For assembly, I glued all the pieces together and included a wooden backdrop for some much needed volume for this display. The abstract for this diorama is Anakin in a Venator-class Star Destroyer having his own iconic hallway scene, defending it from a separatist boarding party. Unfortunately, the wood I've built this diorama out of doesn't have the nice, clean, smooth hallway quality I was looking for, so I decided to make the floors and the walls out of some .02 polystyrene sheets. I also made some struts to keep some space for wiring behind the wall. For the wall, I'm going to freehand some of the Venator patterns, so I marked out where all needed lights, details, door panels, and doors would need to be. For assembling the wall and adding volume to the diorama, I'll continue to add on layers of polystyrene to the wall in the needed places. For the portion of the wall that I wanted to have some lighting, I carefully tried to trace out a crazy man's geographic pattern. Then I went in and tried to carefully cut out the needed light holes with my hobby knife and then rounded the edges with a sanding tool. This didn't turn out quite perfect, but this is definitely a situation where I won't let perfection be the enemy of progress. Again, I'm not a professional, just having a good time visualizing my imagination. Once the wall was satisfactory to me, I could then add some supports onto the back. For the wall decor, I trimmed out some X or H-ish shaped decals and affixed them onto the wall. For the door panel, I just stacked a few squares of polystyrene and a few button shapes together. Just for my own management, I then primed the display with a nice black matte Vallejo prime. Then, I gave the wall a nice covering of a brighter neutral gray and the ground with a darker blue steel gray. Then, I marked out where I'll need to put the lights on the sides of the lighting panel and marked out the dimensions for the size of a door. I then made the lines to guide the light positioning and tested each LED to make sure that I knew which sides were positive and negative. Using my hot glue gun, I attached the LEDs to the backdrop of the diorama. I then put some beads of solder onto the ends of the LEDs and wired them to some wires that can help reach beneath the floor of the diorama. I'm fairly inexperienced with creating circuits, so every step of the way I was making sure to test my lights to make sure that nothing was set incorrectly. I then pierced the bottom of my diorama with a pin vise and threaded the wires through. Once all the wiring was in place, I could then finally mount the external wall into place. I then popped out the needed sizes for the door. Star Destroyer doors have a nice square diagonal pattern to them, which I traced out on my cards. And to add some quick volume to the door, I traced out a square of XPS foam that was appropriately sized. Once the tracings were done, I could then peel the door frame and cut the foam off camera. Using some scraps I had lying around, I made a hallway support beam. Moving back to the door, I cut out a few more squares to create a few layers of detail for a sealed blast door. Once I had cut all the pieces up, I then layered them together with some glue to make a fairly convincing door, actually being one of the highlights of this project for me. Now that all the pieces of the diorama are assembled, I can come in with my airbrush and re-prime the whole of the diorama using the same black prime as before. Then I can base coat the walls and the floor to the similar base coatings as before. For some added detailing, I scoured 2 holes in the door with my hobby knife and painted them black, and then added some charcoal pigment powder around them to make some rather convincing blaster shots into the sealed blast door. For the wall panel, I just painted it in the standard Star Wars bright button colors, red, blue, and a black control console. To clean up and standardize our battle droids, I reprimed each of them with a pure white and then hit them with a bone contrast paint to the body and an intense black to the blasters. These battle droids are sort of anomalous to me because usually painting the models is the most technically challenging aspect of this hobby, but painting these battle droids is actually incredibly easy, and assembling them is much more challenging compared to your average model. Once all the painting was done, I took Anakin and one of the battle droids and put them in my freezer. This will help the glue break later. I then laid a light diffusing film right behind the wall and glued it into place. Again, I checked the circuits to make sure nothing had broke and to double check my work. Anakin came out of his deep freeze, and I popped him free of his blank base. Then I dry fit him on the base and marked on the floor where his saber would potentially hover above. Using my pin vise again, I poked 2 holes into the floor of the diorama. I then put 2 brass rods through the holes, trimmed them to the appropriate height, and glued them into place. Then I put some solder onto the tips of the rods and put a blue LED filament on top of the rods. Again, I tested all my lighting fixtures to make sure I hadn't destroyed anything in the process. I then soldered everything into a parallel circuit, and instead of showing off my amazing electrical skills, I'll show you an abstract of the circuit instead. Overall, it's a battery, a switch, and 3 lights all running in, parallel. I'm aware that's not a very comprehensive explanation of the process, but there are millions of other electrical engineering resources on YouTube that can explain it significantly better than I can. Finally, I got to test my circuit as a whole, and thankfully, it started up without a hitch. For the battery pack, switch, and wiring, I hid those away in the gap underneath the floor. For the droids, 2 of them I will treat as already defeated by Anakin, giving them some battle damage. For one, I'll just pop the head off at the neck with my hobby nippers, and for the second one, I will cut it in half using my hobby saw. For all the cut marks on both of the droids, I will paint it black wherever gray plastic has shown up. I then put some charcoal dusting around each black cut mark. I then painted a portion of the black red and a smaller area within the red orange, and then tied it all together with a red fluorescent paint. Once the defeated droids were properly slashed up, I could glue them into position. Then we can snip Anakin's saber blade free and glue him into position as well. Then we can take our final droid out of the freezer and finally break it into its original parts. Freezing glue makes the glue really brittle and significantly easier to take apart, but you do have to be careful not to break the plastic as well. Then we can let it warm back up to room temperature and reassemble it in a being force pushed pose. Once everyone was in place, I added some wooden veneer to the sides of the diorama and sealed the top of the hallway to clean up the borders a bit. Once everything had the chance to seal and dry, I could then paint the sides black and move on to some glamour shots. Editor interruption here right before the glamour shots. Unfortunately, I took it outside for a matte varnish, and quite literally as I sprayed the matte varnish, my garage roof decided to have a leak directly onto the diorama, leaving these unsightly watermarks. So unfortunately, off camera, I kind of had to do damage control and change the colors a bit, fix it. The high-pitched scream that came out of my mouth as that happened, on one hand, could have been considered hilarious. On the other hand, considered horrifying. Anyway, thank you. It'll look a little different than the actual project we've been working on. Thank you anyway. Yeah, I'll just get to the glamour shots now. To all of you who stayed till the end, thank you. This hobby provides me a much needed escape from life, and sharing these tiny, intricate projects with you really means the world to me. If you'd like to see more of my projects in the future, please feel free to leave a like and subscribe. I'll be back soon with another build, another story, and another journey. Until then, take care. I hope you all have an excellent week. See you around.